You're watching The Paul Stefan Show on TV Free Baltimore.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Paul Stefan Show. You know, just in the news here recently in the state of Maryland, we've been affected because there's been a passage of a new federal tax code. And a number of changes will affect all of the voters and taxpayers here in the state of Maryland. So we're lucky today to have with us the president of the Maryland Taxpayers Association, Dee Hodges. Welcome, Dee.
Hi, everybody, and thank you.
You're welcome. Now, I was very unfamiliar with your organization. Do you find that a lot of people don't know about you guys?
Yes, I do.
And why do you think that is?
Because, you know, the organization is a kind of a rise and fall type thing. Mm-hmm. And when it first started back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a property tax revolt. And it started actually in North Baltimore County, where I live.
Okay.
And people's property taxes were being raised by 10 and 20% a year.
Okay.
So it was whopping.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, people got together and they were kind of ticked about it.
Okay.
And there's a gentleman up there who was an original with the Maryland Taxpayers Association, and he used to help people with their taxes and with their property taxes. So if they wanted to argue that they were unfair, he helped them with how to do it. So he got a room in a high school up there, Hereford High School, and somebody must have called into the radio. And before the night was over, they had to move to the cafeteria. And then they moved to the auditorium. And all of a sudden, there were tax revolt groups in every county.
Wow.
Baltimore County had at least 4 of them.
Okay.
And what happens with taxes is when people get really upset, and apparently property taxes are among the worst, because you have so many people who are paying them directly out of pocket rather than through a mortgage. And so there was a regular revolt. And at that time, most of the counties and the state put through a limit on how much the property taxes could increase as far as what you had to pay. Montgomery County has 10%, Baltimore County has 4%, Anne Arundel County is the best, and it has 2%. The best, I should say, from the property owner's point of view.
Yeah, got it. Okay.
So, but it's interesting. The lower the property tax, the higher the value of your property. So, Baltimore City, I'm amazed that I'm starting to talk about these things.
Go ahead.
Back in after World War II, people began to move to the suburbs. They wanted the so-called white picket fence. And as they started moving out of the city, and Baltimore County was not very well populated, I don't think. And I grew up in Bethesda, so Montgomery County wasn't very well populated either. But they were all moving out where they could have a yard for the kids to play in and all of that. Well, as people started moving out, Baltimore City started raising taxes and property taxes. And by the time I moved to the Baltimore area at the end of 1974, Baltimore City was still raising property taxes.
Wow.
And it quit soon after. But now Baltimore City may have the highest property tax rate in the country.
Really? I thought I knew it was the highest rate in the state, but I don't know about the country.
Well, it may be the highest in the country, but it's certainly one of the highest.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, Maryland has advance payment of property taxes, which effectively makes our taxes higher. We're one of the very few states that do this. And back in the 90s, they changed it so you could pay that a year in advance every 6 months. So it was alleviated a little bit. But Baltimore City has some lovely homes. In fact, some of the first planned communities were in Baltimore cities,
Right,
Roland Park, and they're beautiful homes.
Right.
But if you compare the value of those homes, the selling value, to the ones in Baltimore County, the ones in Baltimore County sell for a lot more because the property tax rate is so much less.
Interesting.
So Baltimore City's about 2.25%, whereas Baltimore County is I think it's about 1%. So it definitely has an effect.
Now, I was going to say, why is the Maryland Taxpayers Association not that well known to the average citizen?
Because once people get their way and get the cuts that they want, and they think that they can be satisfied with them, they stop going to meetings and that sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
So the Maryland Taxpayers Association is really a very small group. However, it is statewide, and we have members of our board from many different counties in the state, not all of them.
Okay.
And we still have a couple of active taxpayer groups in the counties. Montgomery County has a rather active one.
Okay.
And that one is headed by a fiscally conservative Democrat.
Oh, interesting.
So we cover basically all of the parties. A lot of them are basically libertarian.
Okay.
And as I said before
Right.
the show,
Of course.
you have a lot of Democrats, Republicans, and Republicans who are fiscally conservative, and
Right.
they tend to value the libertarian values in that respect. So
Right.
anyway, there's a group in Talbot County. There's a group in Montgomery County. And then occasionally there's a group that will pop up here and there,
Okay.
like Howard and Carroll County and so forth.
Now, do you have any other, besides today, any media outlets? Are there people? Do you get a chance to be access to TV, radio, newspapers, or?
Occasionally, I am interviewed, especially.
Oh, okay.
We testify before the session every year, the
Okay.
legislative sessions on various matters, but mostly tax matters, tax and fiscal matters. And that is very interesting
Okay.
because we tend to be people that are not favored.
Oh.
And so we are the last ones asked to testify.
Oh, interesting. Okay, now I was going to say that since we did have just recently this big overhaul of the federal tax code, to where even legislators themselves and CPAs, tax preparers, don't even know everything that's in there yet. So I don't know if
Right.
you had a chance to look at it or know anything about it, to say, how do you think that federal tax code is going to affect Maryland?
Maryland, it's going to affect Maryland more dearly than any other state. This is rather interesting. And a lot of, on the itemized deduction side, the itemized deductions for SALT, or state and local taxes, and that includes income taxes and property taxes, are going to be limited to a total of $10,000. So that's not particular, doesn't make a lot of people happy, especially in Maryland. Apparently, and I was surprised to learn this, Marylanders have a higher rate of itemizing taxes than any other state in the country.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And that's probably because our income taxes are higher, And surprisingly, our property taxes still tend to be a little higher because we're paying those taxes in advance. I mean, Baltimore City stands out by itself.
Right.
But the rest of the counties, they tend to have a more or less average rate, but we're paying that in advance. So it drives up the rate from above average. Our income taxes, personal income tax, we are the only state in the country that allows its counties to have an income tax. We are the only state in the country that allows its counties to have an income tax. We are the only state in the country that allows its counties to have an income tax. This is known as the piggyback tax.
I was going to ask about that because I know we don't have to just pay a state tax, we also have to pay a county tax.
Right.
And you're saying that's the only one of the 50 states that has this? Or one of the very few?
It's the only state that allows all of its counties to have an income tax.
Oh, okay, there we go. Didn't know
So
that.
the average county income tax in Maryland is 3%. There are a few counties in which it's 3.25%. Montgomery is one, but then there are some rural counties that are like that.
Okay.
In 2008, after Governor O'Malley became governor, they called a special session, and they had it was a huge income tax increase and other sales tax also. The sales tax went up from 5% to 6%. But the income tax, which had been relatively flat at 4.75, was raised to 5.75.
Oh,
Well, when you add on the county piggyback tax of 3%, you're up at 8.75, and for some, it's 9%,
wow.
which puts Maryland in the the 10 worst states.
And that's just talking income tax.
That's just for the income tax. The average corporate tax among the states is probably around 6, maybe 6.5%.
And here, what is it here?
8.25.
Oh, more again.
Yes. And of course, the counties will weigh in, but they weigh in a little bit differently. They also have a business personal property tax, which affects small businesses or pass-through businesses where the owners pay it on their personal income taxes.
Right.
And they have to pay this separately. And on the personal income tax side, they're going to pay the piggyback, plus they're going to pay this. And the depreciation amounts are totally different than they are allowed for business depreciation at the federal side or, even at the Maryland side, because Maryland mostly follows whatever the federal law is.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, with the federal law, the good news is that both Democrats and Republicans believe that there has to be some sort of modification in the tax. Now, whether that's just going to be for very high taxpayers, like property taxpayers or so forth, I don't know. But it would probably be preferable if Maryland tried to go back towards a flatter income tax rather than a graduated tax. Taxing people for success is a big problem. We used to be a country in which we admired people who moved up the ladder.
Right, exactly.
And got wealthier. And if you hit the mark and made it rich because you had some business idea that was really great, it was great. But it also employs a lot of people, and wealthy people, whether they've inherited the money and sit back on their laurels and their dividends. They still invest money in companies. And that those investments employ people. And so it is very important to our way of life. And whenever you have regulations or taxes that retard that, it's not good for Americans or America. It's not good for people to have a chance to move up that ladder. And if you look at things, people can be rich one year, but then the next year they're not so rich. It just happens. They move down as well as up.
Right.
Personally, I think it's unfortunate that we have a welfare system that is legalized as such, that it has no longer become a real step up or a helping hand out of poverty, but it rather has been a weight that keeps people in poverty. So it would be nice if, we should help people out, give them a leg up, but we still ought to be the country that is always imagining things, that allows people's creativity to move on. And to have, say, whether it's 14% or 20% of people who are poor and don't have jobs, the opportunity to have more opportunity through lower taxes and lower regulations, that's the greatest thing that we can do.
I know in recent discussion with Governor Ehrlich, he says the tax structure is slanted against the small business person.
Absolutely.
And he said in small business, not only you talk about self-made person, but small businesses do create jobs.
Yes.
And then that creates more taxpayers.
Small businesses create more jobs than the big corporations do. In Maryland, over the last 10 years or so, I believe Maryland lost about 8,000 small businesses. And that is particularly meaningful in a state where we have already lost a lot of corporations.
That's true.
We started losing them big time in the late 60s and 70s. I was a banker by occupation.
Oh, okay.
And I used to get people coming in saying, well, when I retire, the business is going to be pulling out of Maryland. And then they would say flat out, because Maryland is anti-business. We need to get off of that anti-business thing and come together and be pro-citizen. And by being pro-citizen, we are going to be pro-business because they have the jobs. They create the jobs.
Right.
And as we've known throughout our history, individuals have marvelous ideas, and they create marvelous things. I have a phone in my pocketbook because of that, and that's not so darned old.
There you go, right, exactly. But you're right about that. I mean, I know that, I guess, changing economics is why we lost places like Bethlehem Steel, General Motors, but I, for one, was surprised, and I think it was more of the tax reasons, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, why we lost Black & Decker, because that was really a Maryland business.
Yes, and they had 5 facilities spread across the state back in the 1970s. And then that became weaker and weaker and weaker. The headquarters is still in Baltimore County, but it's a part of Stanley.
Or something like that. Yeah, they got bought out or taken over.
The company that owns it now is a Connecticut company, and Connecticut is not low tax.
Oh, interesting.
But I think that Black & Decker had a harder time, and they got a good deal. The owners of the company got good deals, the stockholders and so forth. So they do sell if they're going to make a lot of money selling.
Right, but they didn't stay here, that's the thing.
No, but there's one office here, and that's in Baltimore County.
Okay. Now, what is the mission and goals of the Maryland Taxpayers Association?
It's really to support reasonable taxation. Government has to have taxes in order to do the things that it should be doing. So we agree with taxation, but it should be reasonable. It shouldn't be something that is harmful. And so we support lower taxes because we think Maryland's taxes are too high. As I said before, we always are in the 10 worst state category
Right, exactly.
for taxes. And also for corporations. And if you're going to be that way, you're not going to have the businesses, and people are going to leave.
Right.
And then Maryland is now the only state left with an estate tax and an inheritance tax.
Wow, yeah.
New Jersey, which was the only other state, is now phasing out its inheritance tax. That's the tax where the estate goes to other people,
Right.
children
Sure.
of children, that sort of thing. The spouse gets the estate for free, basically it becomes the spouse's ownership, but after that, it's going to be highly taxed. Now, the federal law has changed the death tax amount to a much higher rate. I think it's around 11 million. So if Maryland were to follow that, Maryland would be in fairly good shape. There wouldn't be that many people being taxed. But once you are taxed for a death tax, it's nasty.
That's something there. I got the changes going on in the legislature now that, the Maryland tax code has to change, and the governor's waiting to see what the controller comes up with, Peter Francho, for that.
Yeah.
And I know the legislature is concerned about how to reconcile so Maryland taxpayers are not adversely affected by the federal tax code changes.
Yes.
And you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and the federal tax code increases the standard deduction to $12,000 for single people and to $24,000 for married couples. For a lot of people, they won't be able to deduct above those levels. So since they can't deduct above those levels, the Maryland standard deduction is much lower. So it means that the Maryland taxes will go up for people who now itemize.
Right.
Now, I assume that a lot of people itemize above the levels that even the federal government created, so they could be all right. However, there are the limits in the itemizing code, and that is the state and local taxes and the property taxes as a total are limited to $10,000.
Right.
And for a lot of people, that is hurtful. I have looked up the medical deductions. There are a lot of people who have to go into nursing homes, and they pay the full amount.
Wow.
And if you're in a nursing home, you're paying a lot of money, often over $100,000. My mother had MS, a bad case of MS, and she paid the full amount.
Wow.
And she was able to deduct that from her income taxes. So that made all the difference for her. I have read where some people are reporting that the medical deduction is not going to go away, that it actually gets better. You had to eliminate 10% of your medical deductions. You couldn't deduct that before, and now it's supposed to be 7.5% with no limit. So for people, especially the elderly, who are subject to possibly going into a nursing home. If that is true, that will help them. And I've seen it reported that that is true, that they can do that. But I've also seen it reported that there's
can't.
no medical deduction.
There's no medical
So
deduction.
it's still, it's a bit confusing.
Well, I saw like recently in the paper yesterday about Democratic proposals here in the state of Maryland, and one is a change in the personal exemption, is what the Democrats in the legislature are looking for this year.
Make the personal deduction higher.
Yeah, I think whatever the feds are doing, it's about reversing it here at the state level, I think, on personal exemptions.
With the federal tax cut, there is no personal exemption
And I guess
anymore.
Maryland legislators want to maintain that here in the state of Maryland. Be able to have
Yes,
that.
but they might have to, maybe the Democrats are talking about raising it to such an amount that most people will not be affected terribly on their Maryland taxes.
All right, that could be it, yes.
But that could be substantial.
Mm-hmm.
So it would probably be better if they allowed Marylanders who itemize but can't itemize on the federal taxes to be able to itemize on the state taxes, or to raise the state standard deduction to a much higher amount. That would ameliorate the increase in taxes that they would ordinarily have.
And also another point, because there were 3 points, was they said they want to uncouple the estate tax from federal policy, which is something you sort of mentioned already about estate taxes. That's apparently it's a new something to do with estate taxes at the Fed level, that Maryland wants to uncouple their estate tax from the Fed estate tax rule.
If they uncouple it and the estate taxes are higher, it means that we're going to have more snowbirds. And that
more people
means
leaving.
people who retire are moving out
Well,
to
that's
low
not-
tax state or
would
no
not be
no
good.
tax states. There are 9 states in the country that have no income tax.
Right. Now, and also to talked about, they would like to have, to help you, because you talked about this itemization, to allow a charitable deduction for education as a tax credit, in Maryland. Have you heard about that?
I think that I have. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but
I don't know if anybody does yet.
a parent is paying for education, for private education, which definitely helps the state. It helps the counties because they don't have to pay as much for public schools in that sense. If a Marylander is sending their child to a private school or to a religious school or something like that, or homeschooling. That helps the public schools because there are fewer students that they have to teach.
Right.
So, as a sidebar, I would say, and it's just very anecdotal,
Yeah.
some of the kids who are homeschooled that I have met are some of the smartest people I've ever met.
Well, there you
It's
go.
amazing.
That's terrific.
So it's very interesting.
Yeah. Now, this year, I know, because the legislative session just started, what are your organizational goals for this year's legislative session? What is your organization advocating?
Well, we are advocating that the legislature take a look at the entire tax system
Oh, okay.
and pass something that would move us slowly, in states you have to do this slowly, down to some flat tax, perhaps 4.75 or even 3.5. It would be great. So as far as the tax rate, that would be much better. If you added on the local piggyback tax of 3% at 4.75, you're right up at almost 8%. And in
Right.
some counties, you're there.
Right, exactly.
And that puts the state among those
Highest.
areas of the state among the highest tax areas.
In the country.
So it's very it's tough There are, however, I don't think that there are a lot of mandates. 83% of the state budget is mandated. And what has happened is the legislature over the years, and some of these mandates go back to World War I, have passed these mandates to force the governor to have to pay certain categories. And usually with those mandates, they go up by a certain percentage every year. So when people complain that the governor, whoever it is increasing spending, it's because of those mandates primarily, because he's required to. Those mandates have never been reviewed. They need review.
Okay.
I've looked at a few of the mandates, and some of them are really silly. They are really silly. And I often think that, if it's some sort of a silly education mandate, it's not used for the silly reason.
Okay.
It's used for other purposes. There are a lot of unfilled jobs in the Maryland budget. The budget allows for jobs that don't exist yet, but could exist.
Okay.
And this has happened year after year after year.
And these are funded positions, even though nobody
Positions,
sits
nobody is in them.
in those positions.
But what happens with those funded positions is the money becomes slush money.
Oh boy.
And it just goes to the agencies and the departments so that they can spend more. It doesn't necessarily help people. So it would help people if they spent less. So they ought to cut a lot of those positions out. They definitely ought to.
Makes sense.
Back in the early 90s, John O'Neill, who was one of the early presidents of the Maryland Taxpayers Association, said that the tolls on our, the tunnels,
Oh yes.
and so forth. Now, there's a lot of Maryland that doesn't pay any tolls right now.
Oh, okay.
And when the ICC was built, and it had a pretty heavy toll and a very low speed limit, people complained about that all the time. I've taken the ICC. I really like it because it doesn't have a whole lot of traffic,
Right.
and I'm willing to pay the toll,
Okay.
which is a little lower than it used to be. But even so, the tolls are probably still pretty high and create a lot of extra money that is not needed for the purposes of operating those roads, bridges, and tunnels.
Because I know there was a lot of complaints when you talk about that under the O'Malley administration. How he raised all those tolls, and I know Hogan
Yes.
has brought some of them down.
Yes. It was because the toll amounts were made not a legislative thing, but a management thing. So Hogan could do that. So he brought them back pretty much to what they were, but it may still be more than is needed.
Oh, okay.
So I'm saying may. I don't, I don't know that for sure. It would just be really nice if there was a genuine audit of spending in general for what was wasted money and what was helpful money. Because I just think, I think that there is a lot of wasted money in our budget.
Do you or your organization have the ear with Controller Francho? A fellow Montgomery Countyan?
Peter Francho is an interesting person. As a delegate, which he was for many years,
Yes, true.
he was very liberal, and he could spend with the rest of them. But when he became controller, he started realizing what was happening, and he became fairly conservative with spending. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I agree with him, and in many cases, I'm pretty happy with him. He's probably more liberal than I am in social situations. I think as what happens nationally and locally is many of the Democrats express things in an emotional way that, sort of grabs everybody in their heart. And the Republicans are more factual, let's say.
All right.
So, but it's not emotional enough to grab anybody in their heart.
Right.
So it's an interesting dichotomy, the way the two are. You would think that Republicans could make things more emotional for their point of view, and that the Democrats could make things more factual from their point of view. But it seems as though both nationally and locally, the two parties are becoming more and more separate.
But does Controller Francho aware of your organization's agenda?
Oh, I think he is.
He is, he
Yeah.
is. I mean, I don't know if you get things that you put out to the legislature or what it is, so they know what your organization stands for.
As I recall, I used to be on the Ways and Means Committee, and we testify usually before the House
you
Ways
do?
and Means Committee
Okay.
quite a bit.
Okay. Because I was going to say that part of it for me is to say, the methods that you use, do you have lobbyists for your organization?
No, we can't afford it.
Can't afford a lobbyist.
No.
Do you work with legislators, and particular legislators?
We have worked with legislators. And sometimes we've had a legislator representative in both houses.
Okay.
I'm going to get on a different subject now.
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Switch topic then, if you like. It's your floor.
Maryland has what they call nesting districts. We know that there is a redistricting issue before the Supreme Court
Right,
for
right,
our congressmen,
Right.
because it's so gerrymandered.
Yeah, what is this nesting thing?
Well, the nesting thing is in most of the districts, most of the senatorial districts, there are 3 delegates, and they all run at large, or in other words, all 4 people will run in exactly the same area for their jobs.
Right.
But 3 of them will be delegates in the House, and 1 of them will be senator
state
in the
senator.
other House. But effectively, what you have is a 1-house legislature rather than a 2-house legislature because of the way they're elected. It's called, the delegates are nesting within
Oh,
the senatorial district.
I got you.
In Virginia, it started out with a lawsuit about these districts, and then eventually the legislature changed it so that the lower house, the people's house, as they say,
Right.
they have smaller districts than the senator has. Which would more match along the lines of of Congress, where we have 2 senators from every state and they cover the whole state, whereas the congressmen cover their districts. So I think we would have we might have more Republicans in the legislature if we got rid of the nesting districts. But we would have more of a debate, which is really sorely needed.
Well, who beside yourself is advocating for this change?
There is a commissioner out in Carroll County
Okay.
who is putting together a group trying to advocate for the change. So I don't know. We'll see. I think it's a long ways away.
Oh, I was going to say that I would agree with you based upon this particular district that we are in that we have 3 delegates, and the way this district is drawn, part of it is in Howard County. So
Yeah.
2 of the 3 delegates are from Howard
Howard
County and 1 from Baltimore County. So I feel that when something like that happens, people in this part of the district lose out. Because they're going to probably advocate for Howard County or what they're familiar with, as opposed to Baltimore County. I mean, it's not just me. I mean, that's our example, but there are other parts of the state where legislative districts, that is, not congressional, legislative districts are part of 2 or 3 jurisdictions, and they should not be.
Yes.
But if you took away from that nesting, then you say, well, this person has this designated geographic area. You might have somebody who just is a delegate for this part in Baltimore County.
Yeah, and in your district, in this district,
12,
the one person from Baltimore County would also be arguing on behalf of Howard County because of the district that he represents.
He has to, if he wants to be reelected.
So it would be better if he was in a smaller district that represented only Baltimore County.
Right, so I would agree with that idea, and I hope more legislators, or we get it out there so the legislators latch on to that idea.
All of this stemmed from a 1962 Supreme Court decision.
Okay.
And
going on 60 years later, it hasn't happened.
I've forgotten exactly what it was. Yeah, going on 60 years.
Now, there's something your organization did, and I guess it still does. It's called, I think, the No New Tax Pledge.
Yes.
And why don't you talk about that a little, please?
There's a national organization called the Americans for Tax Reform. And they initiated Grover, I can't think of his last name right now because I'm out of mic.
Okay.
Anyway, they initiated a No New Taxes Pledge.
Okay, gotcha. That's what's important.
And the Maryland Taxpayers Association took it up originally. It's sort of a difficult, it's a good pledge because people who've taken the pledge really try to follow it. Although they can do opposite things. They can vote for something else, in the budget that requires the spending of a lot of money, which might require increases in taxes. They would vote against specific increases in taxes, but sometimes they don't think about what they're doing.
Okay.
But the tax pledge is good because people do follow it, especially at the congressional level.
Oh, all right.
However, it has become a thing where Democrats won't sign it, but Republicans will sign it.
Okay, because I was going to say, in the state legislature, you have people. What's interesting is on your website, where I saw this, you have the list of those, I guess, legislators who have signed on to the pledge.
Yes, and our website is not up to date at the present
but you did
time.
have
it should be in the next few weeks.
Yeah, but that's interesting. People can say, these are my legislators or they're not, and say, by seeing it on your website, they can hold those legislators accountable.
Yes.
So why didn't you vote for such and such when you voted for the pledge? That kind of thing.
Well, it mostly gets hammered when somebody votes to raise taxes. I think there was a situation at the federal level a couple of years ago where the people who had signed the pledge were in a really bad position. No matter what they did, it was going to be bad. So Americans for Tax Reform kind of helped them out.
Okay. Now, how can a Maryland voter, a Maryland citizen, become more involved in your organization or what you do, or advocate for your issues?
All they have to do, well, first of all, we do have a membership where people can contribute any amount that they wish.
Okay.
We do communicate usually in the thick of the session, the legislative session. We try to send out something once a week on some of the really pertinent things that are going to be heard in committee during the next week, whether we agree or whether we disagree. And we send that out to our email list.
Oh, okay, good.
And that can be as much as 2,000 people.
Okay, you're getting the word out there. That's good.
So, and if you want to get on the email list, all you have to do is email MD Taxpayers at Verizon.net and ask to be put on the list, and you will be.
That's terrific.
So that is the most, in a way, it's the most frequent thing. But we're going to start working with Facebook.
Okay.
And possibly doing some, like little polls on Facebook, asking people what their opinions are.
Good.
About this or that. And get that on Facebook and maybe Twitter also. Okay. Because so many people do Facebook.
Yes, of course.
They don't do websites as much as they do Facebook.
Okay. Now, any final words that you might have?
Maryland is a great state. It's in an advantageous position. It has a port. It extends on the west, right into the Midwest. It is located next to the south and next to the north. And we've had advantages throughout most of our history. We have a lot of federal employees who live in Maryland. And Maryland has relied on the high pay of those federal employees to pay higher income taxes.
Right.
Which has really harmed the rest of the state. When you look at Baltimore, when I was growing up, and Montgomery County was pasture land.
Right, exactly.
The Baltimore area was the center of the state. I mean, it was the economic center. And it had so many businesses. It was so successful. And people in other parts of the state could be a little bit envious. But Baltimore was a place where if you were born here and grew up here, you were not going to leave the Baltimore area.
Right.
Now that is no longer true, and it's really a sad thing because we've been relying on federal pay, federal salaries, and not supporting businesses the way we should.
Right.
So that is really my final message, is that Maryland needs to go from anti-business to pro-business and pro-jobs and pro-constituents and pro the people of Maryland so that they can be better off. And I also think that they should reform their death taxes.
Okay.
So that grandparents don't have to leave the state and leave their families if they're here.
Right.
But of course, the children may not be here because the businesses aren't here, so they go elsewhere. The whole thing is to bring all of that back. And we're in such an ideal position to do that. I mean, everybody, all these corporations, all these businesses would really like to be here. Right. We're close to the nation's capital. Things can get done here. It's an ideal spot to be pro-business and pro-people.
Right.
So let's get going and do that.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Jim.
And, we'll hopefully see you again in the future. And folks, I want to say this was a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot today. I hope you did too. And so that's the end of another Paul Stefan show, and we'll see you next time.
You're watching the Paul Stefan Show on TV Free Baltimore.